Welcome everybody to game 2 of our Constitution Day doubleheader, following the great historian Linda Colley, who gave a talk earlier today about the importance of the written word, of printed constitutions and their dissemination. And so we have a natural follow-up on that with Professor George Thomas this afternoon, who will talk about the constitutional importance of those things that don't make it into the printed text, our unwritten Constitution, as he calls it. But before that, let me just say a word of thanks to our sponsor for this lecture, and that is Logbook Brewing. This is the only constitutional democracy lecture series that I am aware of that is sponsored by a local brewery. And that sponsorship, sponsorship comes in the form of a case of beer that is in our refrigerator, and so 2 cases. And if you would like to join us for a Pursuit of Happiness hour after the lecture, please do that. We'd be delighted. And while I'm saying thank yous, let me also extend a word of gratitude to Jim Fleming and Linda McLean. This is the James Fleming and Linda McLean Constitution Day lecture. It's one of 2 Constitution Day lectures today. And Jim's a graduate of the University of Missouri. He's had a great career in academia, as has Linda, and they were so generous to endow our Constitution Day lecture series. And so we're grateful for that. And grateful to have George Thomas with us today. Professor Thomas is the Burnett C. Woolford Professor of American Political Institutions at Claremont McKenna College, just outside of Los Angeles. You can tell that from the sunlight coming in through his window in his office where he's sitting. He's a prolific scholar who studies American constitutionalism and American political thought. I've learned a lot from him over the years. He has several books. They include The Madisonian Constitution, The Founders, The Idea of a National University, a 2-volume casebook on constitutional law, and his forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, The Unwritten Constitution, which is here to talk to us about today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much to Justin for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. I would rather have been in person, and Justin didn't tell me it was sponsored by a brewery. That might have given me a little bit more incentive, I say, because that is news. We got to get to work out here on that. But it's also just an honor to speak at the center. I mean, I've watched Justin really build the Kinder Institute over the years, and I direct a much smaller center at Claremont McKenna, and I just have been inspired by all of the amazing things the Kinder Institute's been able to do, the range of scholars, the seriousness of the scholarship, and just not just the quality of the people, but really the range and diversity of it. It's really a model for constitutional democracy. So again, it's an honor to be here for that. It's also an honor to be here following I know the much more prominent and powerful act of Professor Colley. I'm actually reading her book right now. I was sorry I couldn't tune in. I got a little bit of her talk. But it's also an honor for me to give the James Fleming and Linda McLean lecture. These are 2 scholars that have long influenced me. I've learned from them. I've looked up to them. And I'll just say one word about their joint book, Ordered Liberty. It was deeply influential on me in writing my last book, and just how to think about not just constitutional government in terms of the written constitution, which I want to talk about today, but really the whole set of habits and attitudes that are absolutely necessary to sustain constitutional government. I should say also at the outset that I noticed that Justin, interestingly, said that I was offering a natural law follow-up to Professor Colley's talk. I think the fact that Justin thought so, despite my saying nothing at all about natural law, goes some way toward illustrating the argument that I'm making today and in the book. And that's that we tend to read the text of the Constitution based on our presuppositions and antecedent understandings. These are the unwritten pieces of the Constitution I point to that very much frame how we read constitutional text. So when Justin saw unwritten, given his priors, as I'm sure most of you in this audience well know, he thought, oh, natural law. It's an assumption. He read the text of my title in line with his understanding of what unwritten must mean. But that's hardly the only reading. Jim Fleming, who was kind enough to provide a blurb for the book, is sure to read it differently. I'm sure he's thinking, this is a moral reading, or I'm a constitutional aspirationalist. And what I would say is they're both actually trying to understand and make sense of my title to, let's say, be faithful to my title, but they read the text differently because of their unwritten ideas. That's my talk in a nutshell. And I'm sorry to disappoint in one way. I'll say at the outset that even though I have very strong positions on the Constitution often, this book is actually not written from that perspective. I don't actually offer what I think is the right, correct, or best, most faithful understanding of the Constitution. My argument is a little more conceptual and then empirical, and it's essentially that all interpreters on all the questions we really care about, that we're arguing about, are relying to one degree or another on their unwritten ideas and understanding. So the 2 points I really make in the book and that I want to dwell on today is that first, I want to make visible the unwritten ideas and understandings that good faith efforts to interpret the Constitution rest on. I have a particular focus on textualists and originalists, especially textualists and originalist jurists, because they tend to downplay or deny this point. But the second part of the book that I really want to bring out is that most of our central constitutional debates, right, the kind of constitutional debates about what does due process mean, what is equal protection of the laws, can a president pardon herself, right? What's the basis of judicial review? These kinds of arguments, not does the president serve 2 terms, does the president have to be 35 years of age? These, bigger arguments are debates that turn on unwritten ideas and understandings rather than being debates about constitutional text. And these debates necessarily entail constitutional judgments about how to order constitutional commands, principles, and commitments. And it's our unwritten understandings that really drive then our understanding of constitutional text. So today, to sketch my case, and I really want to offer, I think at the outside, kind of a really broad sketch of things. I understand there's kind of a mix of faculty and students and the like, so I want to, at the outset at least, offer a kind of broad overview and not get too bogged down in some of the details of the argument, especially when it comes to constitutional theory, and especially when it comes, let's say, to the variety of originalist constitutional theory. I'm happy to really get into that in the question and answer part. And I'm also going to try to keep the talk on the short side. We'll see if that actually works, but I'm really aiming for that so we can have lots of time for question and discussion afterward to draw out, I think, some of the detailed pieces that I won't get bogged down in the weeds within in the talk. So what I want to do is turn to 3 things, and the first 2 especially. I first want to start with Justice Antonin Scalia for reasons I will get into. And the part about Scalia that's important is too often we do not speak of the unwritten understandings that drive Scalia's textualist jurisprudence and his jurisprudence of original intent. I then from there want to turn back to a founding era debate. It's one of the great constitutional debates that helped frame our constitutional understandings regarding freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And this is a debate around the Sedition Act in 1798, but it also was a debate really that I think illuminates how the Constitution was constructed in some ways, and constructed based on understandings of Republican government, which flowed from understandings of the American Revolution. And in these debates as well, it's really the ideas about Republican government, the American Revolution, its contrast with the British Constitution, that drive how we should understand and read constitutional text. There's really no debate about the text itself in any way. And so I conclude then, very briefly, saying that we inescapably rely on constitutional judgments to bring the Constitution to life. And it would be better if we would acknowledge these unwritten understandings that frame our reading of constitutional text, but that do not themselves and cannot really rely or root themselves in constitutional text. Excuse that. So before I turn, it was an interesting slip, we'd say. So before I turn to Scalia, let me though offer a word of why I think my argument is so important at this moment, because I think some of this might be somewhat obvious. I mean, certainly people like Jim Fleming have made some of these arguments before, and I'm no doubt building on their work, but I think it's something that we need to understand today, because there's a tendency to overlook this when it comes to the court's jurisprudence. Indeed, originalist jurists tend to deny these points, right? They insist that their interpretations are grounded in the Constitution, while other approaches are departures from it. This sentiment has come to frame public debate about constitutional interpretation, and especially discourse on the Supreme Court. So when we look beyond the text, they say, we are inescapably looking to our own political preferences. So for instance, praising Justice Scalia during his confirmation hearings, Justice Brett Kavanaugh frequently turned to his well-thumbed pocket Constitution to suggest that either we are interpreting the precise text of the Constitution, or we are going beyond interpretation and basing our judgments on the best policy, moral philosophy, or something else. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a former law clerk to Scalia, also insisted at her confirmation hearings that Justice Scalia's jurisprudence was her own, as did Justice Neil Gorsuch before her. And to some degree, the public discourse around constitutional interpretation then has relied on, I think, both a kind of conflation of textualism and originalism as if they naturally go together, or that originalist readings are kind of the obvious and inescapable reading of text rather than one of many alternatives to it. And they deny that they're relying on unwritten ideas. They insist they are just relying on the original understanding of the text, and again, kind of merging those two things. And I want to argue the very nature of a written constitution requires us to interpret the written text based on its underlying ideas, not because we're trying to rewrite the Constitution to make it accord with our policy preferences, but because the text does not explain itself. The meaning and significance of a written constitution is itself the subject of debate, and has been since 1787 and 1788. In Federalist 37, for instance, James Madison pointed to the limits of language in conveying complex ideas and concepts by way of a written text. Given the complexity and novelty of the objects defined, Madison said, right, we're going to continually have these kinds of debates. Now, Madison said we could, in some ways, discern meaning over time by constitutional liquidation. That's something we can take up in question and answer. But the point is that moving beyond the text is an inescapable feature of interpreting the written Constitution. This is just as true for so-called textualists and originalists as it is for everyone else. Now, to be fair, I don't think that this is actually news to many scholarly defenders of originalism, but the point is obscured by the most prominent judicial advocates of textualism and originalism. So there's a disjunction between the public face of textualism and originalism, where unwritten understandings are denied or simply merged with text, and the sophisticated scholarship that has grown up around originalism, where unwritten understandings are not only acknowledged, but are a powerful feature of some originalist theory. And so I think bringing this out, making this visible as constitutional issues have become a more visible part of our ordinary politics is crucial. And so we have a better sense of why and how the unwritten Constitution shapes our understanding of the written Constitution. And I want to begin in terms of just making this out before I turn to Scalia again by considering an excellent suggestion from Justice Kavanaugh in an essay insisting on the precise text of the Constitution. And Justice Kavanaugh tells us, and I think rightly, every time we reread the text of the Constitution, which we should do so regularly, and I mean word for word, Justice Kavanaugh says, we should also reread Marbury v. Madison. That, of course, is the case where the court first articulated and exercised the power of judicial review. Kavanaugh goes on to say that that case has profound lessons to this day about the status of the Constitution, how to interpret the Constitution, and the judiciary's role vis-a-vis the other branches in interpreting the Constitution. I say this especially to the students in the audience. Take this advice. Read the Constitution. Word for word, as Justice Kavanaugh says, as you read, perhaps for the first time, but I suppose probably not many in this audience, Marbury v. Madison. Now, if you do, you'll immediately notice that when Chief Justice Marshall gets to the argument justifying judicial review, the central logic of his argument is rooted in an unwritten assumption about the written nature of the Constitution. Marshall's argument is rooted in, to borrow Alexander Hamilton's words from Federalist 78, the nature and reason of the thing. It is rooted in a political theory of written constitutions. And it is this theory that guides Marshall's understanding of text. Marshall says, all those who have framed written constitutions contemplate them as forming the fundamental and paramount law of the nation. And consequently, the theory of every such government must be that an act of the legislature repugnant to the Constitution is void. As Marshall insists, this is quoting Marshall, this theory is essentially attached to a written constitution and consequently to be considered by this court as one of the fundamental principles of our society, close quote. The written constitution rests on a theory, a set of unwritten understandings that we must treat as one of the fundamental principles of American society, and that's that the Constitution must control ordinary laws passed by the legislature. So the crux of Marshall's argument, right? Think of Kavanaugh saying, read the precise text of the Constitution. The crux of Marshall's argument for judicial review does not turn on the precise text of the Constitution. It turns on his unwritten theory. He doesn't even cite constitutional text for his central contentions, right? And those who rejected Marshall's argument for judicial review denied his theory. They didn't turn to constitutional text to dispute Marshall. They didn't say, oh, the text doesn't support this. There was a little bit of that actually, but the larger argument and the one most powerfully offered to counter Marshall by Judge John Bannister Gibson, a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, argued that fundamental law can't be read as Marshall was reading it. And why can't it? It depended on his theory of a written constitution. And Gibson argued the Constitution doesn't come before the court. Gibson's argument, again, like Marshall's, rests on a theory of the written constitution, on the unwritten constitution. And Marshall's argument says judicial review must be implied by the Constitution if a written constitution is to have meaning, so that courts can strike down acts of the legislature that violate the Constitution or statutes that go against the Constitution. Gibson didn't deny the importance of a written constitution, but he did deny that it was enforceable by courts. Gibson said that let me, the exact quote, I am of the opinion that it rests with the people in whom full and absolute sovereign power resides to correct abuses in legislation by instructing their representatives to repeal the obnoxious act. My whole point is that when you think of Kavanaugh insisting on the precise text of the Constitution and say, go read Marbury v. Madison, again, excellent advice. You should notice that the most important dispute here about the nature of judicial review and whether it's justified does not turn on text. It turns on the unwritten ideas that underlie the Constitution. So let me turn to Justice Scalia, because I want to bring out Scalia's thinking about textualism, originalism, and the written constitution. And I focus on Scalia largely because he is this judicial icon. And again, in the work itself, I engage scholarship a lot, but I focus mostly on court opinions and on the opinions and actions of political actors, because I want to show that it's courts, especially the Supreme Court in its opinion, and political actors, unwritten assumptions that are driving the text. And I want to kind of bring out again the disjunction between what I think of as originalist scholarship, which is pervasive, powerful, and really interesting, and the somewhat, I think, more simplistic and less compelling view of originalist and textualist jurists. So why I turn to Scalia is that even after his passing, I mean, perhaps it's obvious, but let me put a word in its defense. Even after his passing, he remains the most visible and influential exponent of textualism and originalism. He's a conservative judicial icon, the personification for most of textualism and originalism in the public mind. Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett all consider him a mentor and a role model. I mean, so much so, right, that when Justice Kennedy was retiring and it was announced that he was retiring and they were all praising Justice Kennedy, they would praise Justice Kennedy and said, now let's go appoint a jurist like Scalia to the court, right? And so much so that in fact, when Scalia passed away, for the first time since 1844, right, the Senate said, we're not going to actually have hearings or hold a vote on this nominee until after the election. But I should also note at the outset, though, that Scalia does have his critics in originalist circles. Randy Barnett, for instance, a leading originalist scholar, denies that Scalia is in fact a originalist at all at times. Similarly, Yale law professor Akhil Amar, who also considers himself an originalist, thinks that Scalia only occasionally applies originalism, and often, he says, not that well. So I want to acknowledge that originalist scholarship and thinking has actually gone far beyond Scalia. And yet, Scalia's understanding continues to shape the public mind, and many scholars, from a Stephen Calabrese of the older generation to a very young and actually a former student of mine, Alon Werman of the younger generation, not only both advocate originalism, but both think of Scalia as the judicial titan that we should be following in this sense. So I want to turn to Scalia to highlight, I think, the unwritten assumptions that frame his reading of constitutional texts. So in turning to Scalia, let me highlight at the outset, I think, the two reasons he gives us for following original meaning. And the first reason is, as Scalia argues in his classic piece, Originalism, the Lesser Evil. And you should note the subtitle. I think it says interesting things about Scalia's argument. And that's that, as Scalia puts it, the main danger in judicial interpretation of the Constitution is that judges will mistake their own predilections for the law. Scalia offers originalism as a solution to this weakness, right? And this is why for Scalia, it's the lesser evil, right? It still has its problems, but it's better than alternative approaches. And for Scalia, what's most important here is that when judges and justices turn to interpreting the Constitution, especially more abstract phrases, they will be tempted to read what they want into the Constitution, right? Or maybe they just take their presuppositions and read them in. And Scalia's worry then is you're actually distorting constitutional meaning for obvious reasons. Scalia then says, originalism offers something outside of the judge or justice to rely upon to frame and shape our reading, especially of these larger abstract provisions of the Constitution. So for Scalia, the first claim to why we should follow original meaning is because it, unlike rival theories of interpretation, is the best way to limit judicial discretion. Now, I want to just pause for a moment to say what's, should be obvious, but I think is not always obvious. Limiting judicial discretion doesn't find any justification in text. The text says nothing about judicial discretion. It does not say we should limit it in any way. I mean, that doesn't mean it's not a powerful argument. Right? It may well be a powerful argument, but the argument's going to turn on how powerful we think the unwritten assumptions are, the unwritten idea, the unwritten theory driving it, that then informs our reading of text. And Scalia wants to limit judicial discretion, partly because of his understanding of democracy, which I'm going to get to more in a second. But the important part here is that Scalia's advocacy of judicial discretion, guided by original meaning, insists that we should read abstract clauses of the Constitution, or potentially abstract or open-ended clauses of the Constitution, in a narrower manner. And we should do that precisely because those open-ended provisions, think of the privileges or immunities clause of the 14th Amendment, which I want to dwell on in just a moment, right? Those clauses could be, for Scalia, invitations for the judicial creation of rights. So let's turn to an oral argument and an exchange with Scalia that I think highlights this point. And I think it then brings out some of Scalia's jurisprudence that we don't actually think about as carefully as we should in why he reads the text how he does. And the case I want to turn to is Mcdonald v. Chicago. For those of you who know, it was a case about whether or not the Second Amendment, right, the amendment that Scalia had a few years before said protected an individual right to own a gun, applied to the states by way of the 14th Amendment. So the question is, when we come upon the 14th Amendment and we see no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, the open-ended question is, well, what liberties can't you be deprived of without due process of law? Scalia, following actually an earlier textualist who makes up the first chapter of my book, Justice Hugo Black, has a handy answer to that as well. And that is that only those rights enumerated in the Constitution by way of the Bill of Rights count as the liberty protected under due process. Scalia actually goes a little bit further than this, and I can get into this in the discussion, and says actually rights protected by long-standing tradition can also be protected. But Scalia, like Justice Hugo Black before him, also a great constitutional textualist, used to carry his pocket constitution around long before Justice Kavanaugh did, and would point to it and say, "Show me where in the Constitution." Which actually I think is a good practice. We ought to be able to point to the Constitution and say where things are in the Constitution or why we understand particular textual provisions in a particular way. But to go back to this argument with Scalia, so the question was, all right, does the Second Amendment, by way of the 14th Amendment, now apply to the states? And so in the spring of 2010, the Supreme Court heard argument about this. The interesting twist here was that counsel arguing that the right did apply to the states actually argued that it wasn't just as part of the liberty under the 14th Amendment, but the Second Amendment right to bear arms was part of the privileges or immunities of citizenship. Now, if you crack open, hopefully Justin's handing out pocket constitutions at these events. If you crack open your pocket constitution and you turn to the 14th Amendment, you will see that the first thing it does after making all persons born in the United States citizens of the United States, before it turns to liberty or equality, is that it says, and no citizen shall be deprived of the privileges or immunities of citizenship. But what are those privileges and immunities of citizenship? Again, one of those clauses that is more open-ended, right? It doesn't then specify those privileges and immunities are, the following. It leaves that part open. So when this question came up before the court and the lead counsel was insisting that the right to bear arms was rooted in the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. Scalia was rather shocked, and shocked despite the fact that originalist scholars across the political spectrum had actually lined up offering briefs saying that this would be the proper place to root a right to bear arms, and this would accord with the original understanding of the 14th Amendment. Scalia didn't bite. Indeed, he was completely dismissive of the argument. He wanted to know why we should attempt to return to the original meaning of the Privileges and Immunities Clause, given that it was at odds with over 100 years of Supreme Court precedent. Even though it was also widely acknowledged, especially in originalist circles, where some of the most interesting work on privileges or immunities of citizenship and the meaning of the 14th Amendment is done. In fact, with some contempt, Scalia asked the counsel if he was bucking for a place at some law school faculty, and then sort of dismissively said, the Privileges or Immunities Clause is the darling of the professoriate. Now, what I want to highlight here is, on the one hand, it seems very interesting at sort of first blush to say that a putative textualist is so dismissive of text. I mean, the Privileges and Immunities Clause is there. It's a first clause in the Constitution. It's not like we're turning outside this for something. It's in the text. He was dismissive. And it's interesting that a putative originalist is so dismissive of originalist arguments. And yet, if we turn back and we think Scalia's understanding of text and originalism are first and foremost driven by limiting judicial discretion, it actually really fits into place and makes sense, right? I mean, he's precisely worried that it's an invitation to read in rights. And maybe the original understanding of the Constitution was that there are those who would say, or maybe there's just a whole list of unwritten ideas that we can actually track down, reasonably consistently, which some argue. But again, those pieces are more open-ended. And this came out in oral argument. So peppered with questions about what would the privileges or immunities of citizenship be, lead counsel admitted, as many before him had, including many who framed the 14th Amendment, it was difficult to give a full description of all the unenumerated rights that might be protected by the 14th Amendment under the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And Justice Scalia quipped, "Doesn't that trouble you?" It certainly troubled Scalia. And my contention is it doesn't just trouble him, it's the organizing feature of his textualism and his originalism. It's the need to obviate judicial willfulness within the democratic government that leads Scalia to text in this way. But I want to pause to even push this point, right? Because when Scalia says that, okay, we could root a Second Amendment right to bear arms, say, an individual right, in the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment, right? So we won't root it in the Privileges and Immunities because that's too open-ended. When he says, well, we can root it in the Due Process Clause, so you can't be deprived of a certain liberties without due process of law, Scalia and some other originalists, and Justice Black especially, as he argued in the middle years of the 20th century, all act as if it's perfectly obvious that the liberty in the 14th Amendment points to the Bill of Rights and says, hey, these rights, that's what we mean by liberty. I mean, but if that's textually so, why didn't the text just say that? That would seem easy enough. No state can deprive any person of rights listed in the Bill of Rights, or to be actually more textually accurate, in the first 8 amendments to the Constitution. But that's not what the text says. Now, Scalia's reading might be a very powerful one. Scalia's reading might be one we really want to follow, but it's not because he somehow has captured the text perfectly. It really depends more on whether we're persuaded by, follow, think powerful, his unwritten understandings that are driving his reading of constitutional text. Now, let me turn, if a bit more briefly, to the second argument that Scalia uses to justify original meaning. And this comes out in his original piece, that is Originalism, the Lesser Evil, but it comes out more fully in his book, A Matter of Interpretation. And that's that Scalia says the original meaning of those who ratified the Constitution, right? Not those who framed it. I'll offer a little bit of a sketch here, especially, I suppose, for students who might not know it. And that's it. There's in original circles these days, there's a very serious discussion about original intent, that is what's called framers' intent, and original meaning, or what's called ratifiers' intent. Most originalists, beginning really with Scalia, but most originalists these days think that we should follow ratifiers' intent. And there are really powerful reasons for this. The argument is, and they draw on James Madison here in part, the Constitution was really only authorized and legitimated as law when it was ratified by the people. That's what made it binding, right? And so Scalia's version of popular sovereignty and democratic self-government really informs his understanding of originalism, and now this has become the dominant understanding. And yet, when we think about that understanding and his insistence on limiting judicial discretion, those can be somewhat at odds with one another. Those don't necessarily, they can go together, but they don't necessarily go together. And what's interesting is that many originalists, I don't want to say most, but many originalists have actually sort of altogether abandoned the first justification, even though I think it was most prominent in Scalia early on. And that's partly because the first generation of originalists didn't actually say much about democratic legitimacy and popular sovereignty, because they were preoccupied not by ratifiers' intent or original meaning, but by framers' intent. And they thought framers' intent was a great way to limit, again, judicial will, judicial lawmaking. Scalia kind of breaks from that, and most originalists have broken from that. And they've also broken, in many ways, from this idea of judicial restraint or judicial acquiescence to legislatures. And in fact, I don't want to quite call it a rhetorical slight, because I actually think they're trying to get at something important. Originalists often now, rather than using judicial restraint, use the term judicial engagement. And what they mean by that is simply that, look, that if you buy original meaning and you're adhering to it, it could be that the legislature is doing all kinds of things that are against original meaning. And so it could require a completely activist court. I mean, activist just in, it's doing lots of things, but is justified in striking down that legislation, because that legislation is at odds with the original meaning of the Constitution. And so they, recognizing this, have said, we should capture a term that's not as fraught as activism, because that implies kind of going beyond the Constitution rather than just actually considering whether or not a statute is legitimately and lawfully passed by the legislature, or whether it's unconstitutional. So they've turned judicial engagement. But I want to go back to Scalia just for a second there, because I think this argument that we get from Scalia about popular sovereignty and why that justifies judicial review today also says something about his unwritten understandings of democracy, and leads to some of the clashes we see between originalists over ideas about democracy and the role of courts in democracy. So when you think of Scalia's understanding here, and the understanding is that, look, when you originally ratified the Constitution, the people did, you encoded meaning onto that text. And why courts can 200 plus years later actively strike down acts of the current and contemporary legislature that go against that, original ratification, is that the people, as the popular sovereign, authorized them to do it. Now, Scalia translates this into saying that, so it's only in areas where the text is really clear, or really clear based on his reading. I think he narrows, in my view, privileges or immunities of citizenship, right? So he's in some sense narrowing what the text actually said. But Scalia's argument for democracy there, and he put this forward in address at Gregorian University in Rome. He said the whole theory of democracy is that the majority rules. That's the whole theory of it. And then he insisted, right? Yep, the minority loses except to the extent that the majority in its document of government has agreed to accord minority rights. Now, what I just want to highlight here is, first, that's an unwritten understanding of democracy. Right? That understanding of democracy might be consistent with text. It might accord with certain readings of text, but it is not derived from the text itself. Originalist critics often say, and it's not derived from an originalist understanding of democracy either. Some of his most ferocious critics along these lines, someone like Professor Randy Barnett at Georgetown Law, insists that he actually gets the American version of constitutional democracy that underlies the written Constitution profoundly wrong. That he's really, in some sense, other originalists argue, kind of misconstrued or fundamentally neglected the nature of America's social compact. And the point is that in sorting out this debate, whether, say, Scalia's majoritarian understanding of democracy with a very circumscribed role of courts, or a much more complex form of democracy that not only doesn't allow for simple majoritarian rule, but because it believes in some notion of natural rights as part of the social compact, marks off and circumscribes all kinds of areas that democratic majorities are not allowed to touch. And some of what it does there would actually protect, think again, privileges or immunities of citizenship, potentially unenumerated rights, and invite judicial protection of those rights. My point is simply that this debate, right, does not turn wholly on constitutional text. That the most important features of this debate turn on our underlying understanding and assumptions about the nature of the democratic government and the kind of democratic government the Constitution rests upon. They turn on those readings of the social compact that then inform our understanding of the written text. On that note, let me turn back then to a debate from the 1790s. Because this debate really was about the nature of Republican government and the social compact. And this is the debate over the 1798 Sedition Act. It invited, I want to argue, a profound debate on the reflection of what Republican principles meant and how they informed the written Constitution. It was a debate about the very nature of constitutional self-government. So let me, for those of you who might not remember, just refresh you on what the Sedition Act did. Sedition Act made it a crime to write or speak false, scandalous, and malicious things against the government with the intent to defame it or bring it into disrepute. The act, unlike the traditional common law of seditious libel, allowed those prosecuted under it to argue for the truth of what they had said or written. And so the whole question is this consistent with the First Amendment's command, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press? And my point is that there was very little, I could say almost no disagreement about constitutional text. All agreed that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The question is what is the freedom of speech or the press? Now, I also want to pause here just to kind of come back to a point about originalism that I think we should understand and talk about a little bit more. Now, originalism, and I think that this is actually remains kind of the prevailing understanding in the public mind, is a deeply historical enterprise that really is in some sense trying to go back and look at debates from the day to see how those who framed, ratified the Constitution understood these words and the debates themselves, right? And so part of what we would do is go back and look at what were the debates over, say, freedom of speech or freedom of religion, which also occurred these moments. And those understandings then inform how we read constitutional text. So when you come to a concept like the freedom of speech, how you fill in the contours of that concept is we go back to the history to see what do they mean by this. That's actually not non-existent and certainly exists in the work of historians these days. But that's not the prevailing mode of analysis in originalist scholarly circles. Originalist scholarly circles turn to say that what we're actually looking for is what did those words mean to the average reader at the time. We don't actually need history to tell us that. It's much more of a linguistic exercise that turns to dictionaries from the time and the like to inform us of those words. I just want to pause to note that that could be incredibly beneficial with certain kinds of words, like what did commerce mean in 1787, 1788? That's much more difficult when you're dealing with concepts. The freedom of speech or religious liberty are harder to kind of narrow down in those terms. I also want to point out that that originalism in some ways is interesting because it also like creates this reader of the Constitution that doesn't actually exist in history. And that's something we want to think about, because I think that's a kind of construction that goes on all the time, but isn't acknowledged, at least in our public debates. And I think actually in originalist scholarship, this is only acknowledged by some. And so I want to potentially in question and answer, and maybe if I have time right toward the end, highlight that. But let me turn back then to this debate, because I think this debate actually brings out features of constitutional interpretation that are actually broader than what we would think of as just ordinary interpretation. This is not a matter of simply bringing out the latent meaning of text. But this is in some ways saying that our understanding of text needs to be constructed in accordance with our understanding of the very nature of Republican government. So to think about how this debate unfolded, right, defenders of the Sedition Act, and they were numerous, including most jurists that were sitting on the Supreme Court who sat in circuit courts at the time. It never went to the Supreme Court, but it was in numerous district courts, and those trials were presided over by Supreme Court justices. And I'm going to talk about Justice Samuel Chase in just a second. But defenders of the Sedition Act turned to the British common law inheritance, and they thought it framed the meaning of freedom of speech and the press. The critics, most powerfully James Madison, argued that this argument distorted the American understanding of Republican government, and therefore it distorted what the American Constitution had done, because it was misreading the social compact that the Constitution rested on. In this, I think, and this is where I think I kind of want to push that we're actually engaged in what I would call, and we'll define in a little bit, constitutional constructions a lot more than we are engaged at times in constitutional interpretation, and that these necessarily turn on unwritten understandings. That doesn't make them illegitimate. They're efforts to understand the text, but they're kind of constructing that understanding based upon deeper underlying principles. And these questions are often forced on us. And the truth is, maybe we haven't thought about them yet. And so there's not necessarily a kind of latent original meaning to turn to. There can be, there often is, I think, but that doesn't mean there always is. And this is one of those instances where, yes, free speech was discussed prior to the creation and ratification of the Constitution. During both the framing of the Constitution and the ratification debates, there were those who argued that the Constitution needed to protect freedom of speech and the press, and many state constitutions, like Virginia's, offered such protection. Yet, just what that protection entailed was rarely discussed. I mean, there were incidents of it, but there was never this big debate to turn to. So the debates over the Sedition Act, in some ways, kind of force us to wrestle with this question and then draw out or construct or build constitutional meaning. So that this was an effort to not just bring the written Constitution into being and actually kind of live by what it's commanding. What we're trying to do is say, so what, when we created this government and we have this underlying understanding of what Republican government is, what version of free speech does that necessarily require? Or what does free speech actually have to look like to accord with a government rooted in, as Madison wants to insist, popular sovereignty? The text isn't all that much help here, right? Because they agree on the text. So let me start with Federalist jurists, both of whom sat on the Supreme Court as well, like Samuel Chase and James Iredell. They turned to William Blackstone to gloss the meaning of freedom of speech and the press. So both Chase and Iredell argued that punishing seditious libel, that is, speech that aimed to bring the government into disrepute, right? To defame the government, was itself punishable because it was not just a kind of libel against the government, but seditious libel, right? They argued that that was perfectly consistent. Prohibitions on speech that defamed the government were perfectly consistent with the freedom of speech. And that was because they were drawing on Blackstone's understanding in this common law inheritance. Now, notice again, you're already kind of like one step removed from text because you're saying, well, how do we make sense of text? William Blackstone is the best way to make sense of text. So we're turning to history here to, draw out, illuminate our reading of text. So as Chase put it in one of the trials that he was presiding over, he said a licentious press was particularly harmful to the Republican form of government because it could, quote, corrupt the public opinion and destroy the morals of the people, close quote. It was imperative then that such speech be punished to protect the government in a republic. Now, Chase goes on to say, yes, elections in Republican government are important, but once the election has occurred, then you must acquiesce. So as Chase puts it, once the power of the minority has been displaced because they lost the election, essentially, they must, in Chase's words, surrender up their judgment. Chase went so far as to argue that, again, quote, private opinion must give way to public judgment or there must be the end of government, close quote. So only those whom the nation had chosen by way of elections can weigh in on such questions. To persistently criticize the government with improper motives, in Chase's words, to try to influence the public against the government was unacceptable. In fact, Chase charged the jury in one of the most famous cases from the times, referring to the defendant's criticism of President Adams. And he said, the criticism was done of President Adams with the intent to bring the president into contempt and disrepute and excite against him, that is Adams, the hatred of the people. That was properly punishable by the Sedition Act because it was not constitutionally protected speech. It didn't matter that the defendant might think his opinions were true. The defendant admitted it. The defendant said, I am trying to bring him into disrepute. He's no George Washington. He's John Adams. Here's the list of things that he's doing. This is why John Adams deserves to be defamed, essentially. Right? And one of the interesting points here is lots of these constitutional arguments actually get made from ordinary citizens in really extraordinary ways. But Chase's insistence was that it was no longer the defendant's place, once you had the election, to try to shape the public mind against the sitting government. It was his place to acquiesce. Now, that's an understanding of freedom of speech that few of us would accept these days, right? And it was James Madison who most powerfully argued against it at the time. And Madison's argument was that this common law inheritance simply misunderstood the nature of Republican government. Madison said free speech had to have a new meaning in America. And to understand this new meaning, we would have to understand the foundations of the Constitution and the revolution in government it reflected. Madison's argument largely turned on the nature of Republican government. He does actually give us some reading of the First Amendment at the time. And interestingly, and think about this just in terms of thinking about text, in these debates, especially between a James Madison and a John Marshall at times, they're both referring to what we now think of as the First Amendment as the third article of amendment, because when the Bill of Rights went out to the states, it was the third article of amendment. The first two never got ratified at the time. The second actually got ratified as the 27th Amendment, some 200 plus years later. But the point is, you didn't even necessarily have a completely stable text in 1798 at this moment. So Madison rejected the common law inheritance, right? And his argument was this idea of freedom of the press that Chase and Iredell are arguing for can never be admitted to be the American idea of it. And That's because of the essential differences in the British Constitution and the American Constitutions. And Madison's key argument was that in the American system, power flows from the people. And so it's got to allow the people, the popular sovereign, to criticize the government, right? It's the government that's bound by the Constitution, and the people can point out failures of the government to either live up to the Constitution or stray from the Constitution. They've got to be able to, in Madison's terms, defame the government, and defame the government based upon their political opinions, right? Otherwise, you don't really have a popular government, right? So the argument, again, really is an argument between Madison and company and Chase and company over the nature and logic of Republican government, how that differs from governments in the past, and why Republican government, rooted in elections and popular sovereignty and the like, has to require a particular understanding of freedom of speech. So the concept, the freedom of speech, is getting filled in, I want to argue, as we go, based upon Madison's and company's thinking, what would this require of us? And if you allowed the government, say, to silence its critics, wouldn't this distort and corrupt the whole nature of the kind of Republican government rooted in popular sovereignty that we just thought we brought about? That doesn't mean they had thought a lot about freedom of speech before that. There are lots of kind of conflicted views throughout the 18th century on this, but they're forced to then confront this. And so I think here's an instance of Madison in particular, where textual meaning is being constructed from the political theory that underlies the Constitution, right? And so his arguments against the Blackstonian understanding of freedom of speech and the press were part of creating Republican governments rooted in individual rights and popular sovereignty, right? A government that had to allow citizens to dissent against the sitting government. And so this, we could kind of sketch, and this goes far beyond just the textual reading here, because I think what Madison and company are really doing is also trying to say that, all right, this government we've created requires a host of things that we haven't necessarily thought through carefully, but are clearly required of us. And so part of building constitutional meaning in the sense, as well as actually building constitutional government, not only requires that we have things like freedom of speech, especially when it comes to democratic elections, but that we actually have political parties who are vying with one another and competing for the public's support, and that you're able then to criticize and legitimately criticize without punishment the sitting government in power. So concepts are being worked out like a loyal opposition. And there's this great line, a term that's actually not used very often, and starts being used about now, but there's a great line from, I want to say it's Thomas Cooper's trial, where Cooper starts to insist that this is the equivalent of a loyal opposition, and that word or phrase starts to get picked up at this time. And that's also part of really kind of constructing the meaning of freedom of speech, because it's then going to rest on a host of understandings about Republican government that really in the process at this moment of being worked out. And so let me just close with Madison, with his statement on the real difference here in the kind of Republican government that America has created and the kind of government that Chase, Iredell, and others are actually defending at the time. And Madison says, quote, "The nature of governments elective, limited, and responsible in all their branches may well be supposed to require a greater freedom of animadversion than might be tolerated by the genius of such a government as that of Great Britain. In the latter, it is a maxim that the king, an hereditary, not a responsible magistrate, can do no wrong, and that the legislature, which in 2/3 of its composition is also hereditary, not responsible, can do what it pleases. In the United States, the executive magistrates are not held to be infallible, nor the legislatures to be omnipotent, and both elective are both responsible. It is not natural and necessary under such, is it not natural and necessary under such different circumstances that a different degree of freedom in the use of press should be contemplated?" my point on concluding on this part of the talk is that Chase, Iredell, Madison, and company were all engaged in situating constitutional text within understandings of the American constitutional enterprise, and that their debates over constitutional meaning were shaped by their political theorizing about the nature of constitutional government. And I'll go even further. I think Madison and company were really engaged in, at that moment, building the American Constitution, actually constructing it as a functional government that required certain developments, including not just the loyal opposition and a viable two-party system, but very much including those as part of freedom of speech. So let me conclude by saying that, first, that just because I'm pointing out that so much of constitutional interpretation relies on unwritten understandings, I hope, as I made clear at the outset, that I don't think that that makes it illegitimate in any way. I think actually that this could be helpful in as a political community in our thinking about how we read the Constitution, because what we should have is an obligation to bring out our unwritten understandings that are guiding our reading of text, to make arguments about why we think our understanding of the Constitution, which then requires a certain kind of interpretation, is the best understanding of the Constitution and makes the most sense of text. And I also want to be clear, I'm in no way suggesting that we should neglect text in any way. I think justices like Scalia have done us a great service in insisting that we pay attention and careful attention to constitutional and text. My point, though, is that when it comes to our most important disputes, we are really arguing about the best reading of text, what it really means to be faithful to the Constitution. And I want to end by saying, I think this inescapably includes making constitutional judgments that are not themselves going to be rooted in constitutional text, but that inform not just our understanding of the particular provisions that might be in dispute, but that really inform our understandings of the whole Constitution, right? And in this, I want to say there's no safe place to stand. Originalists and textualists, I think, want to say that they can take solace in that their reading or understanding of the whole Constitution is somehow a constitutional given, as if it's kind of obvious by the text or by, in originalist terms, that of course an originalist understanding is the obvious understanding of the Constitution. I don't actually think that's so. I think those things are precisely what are in dispute. And I think then we're obligated in confronted with these questions to engage often in ordering how we think potentially different and conflicting pieces of the Constitution fit together, and that those judgments, all we have for those judgments, I actually think this is very inherent in the constitutional enterprise, are the reasons we have for making those judgments. And they could be reasons very much grounded in history and turning to the founders and turning to constitutional developments. They can also be judgments rooted in more moral or philosophical understandings. I think they ought to be tethered to why we think that the Constitution requires us to think in these ways, and we should articulate that. But let me give an example of what I mean by this. And I think it comes out, for instance, in the reasonably recent voting rights case, and that's Shelby County. And I want to just highlight in closing the dispute between a Justice Ginsburg and a Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts. So looking at this case, Justice Ginsburg argued that given the history of discrimination in voting procedures, particularly against Blacks in many Southern states, the court ought to give wide latitude to Congress in order to protect minority voting rights. So what's at issue here, just to be really quick about this, was that Congress required certain states, before they made alterations in their voting procedures, to pre-clear those with the Justice Department, right? And it had only targeted certain states with this history of discrimination. And so the argument was that acceptable to do in order to protect voting rights? And some of the critics were like, well, it's not really okay to subject just a select number of states to this, especially when we're basing those states having pre-clearance for changes to their voting rights on things they had done often decades and decades and decades ago, right? And had things changed. Now, Ginsburg's argument was that it had really worked. It had protected minority voting rights. And so she thought Congress was justified in doing this. And she urged the court to defer to Congress's information gathering and the past record of eliminating race-based discrimination in voting that had plagued America's democratic process, right? So what I want to argue here is that Ginsburg, kind of confronted with issues of federalism and state sovereignty and voting rights, was, making an ordering where she said, well, I think all in all in the constitutional scheme, voting rights have to come first. And here's why I think voting rights have to come first. The court, in an opinion by Chief Justice Roberts, argued that on the basis of principles of federalism, the Congress should not require certain counties or states to get pre-approval from the national government before enacting laws related to voting. He said, yes, there's a history of racial discrimination, but that was in many cases 50 plus years ago. And today, in 2013, Congress should not treat, due to state sovereignty, state and considerations of federalism differently. I want to say, look, both of these are actually really quite reasonable understandings, right? Roberts is saying, like, look, when we think about the structure of government, federalism in this particular case comes before voting rights, right? And it comes before voting rights for reasons that then Roberts articulates. Ginsburg says, no, I think voting rights have to come before federalism in this case. I think that they're both on their face quite plausible, quite reasonable opinions, right? And they're the kinds of opinions that we should force ourselves to wrestle with. But neither opinion really can kind of point to text and say, aha, my reading is definitive. I think that there are moments where we can do that. I'm just saying most of our constitutional disputes, the ones we're really engaged in, aren't of that nature. And so what we really need here is a Roberts saying, this is why actually federalism comes first. And he's got to make judgments about why federalism ought to come, and I think he does, why federalism ought to come before voting rights in this particular case. But the text of the Constitution is not going to make that judgment for him in this case. And the same goes for Ginsburg's argument, right? So that's what I mean about there's an inescapability of constitutional judgment that we should, and no easy place to rest there. And we should acknowledge that much more clearly than we do. And it's these orderings then that really, again, inform the interpreter's understanding of text. Now, I want to just close on that note saying that when we think about a whole host of constitutional issues, separation of powers, federalism, the idea of dual sovereignty, judicial deference, judicial engagement, all these concepts, right, really turn in the end on our unwritten understandings. And it's those unwritten understandings that really guide, even in some sense, construct our textual readings. And there's no escaping that these principles and concepts form the ideas that give text meaning. So at the most foundational level, right, we should acknowledge these disputes rather than trying to duck them. I think not only will it be better for our political debates, and this will be my last line, I also think that this acknowledges honestly the ongoing project of constitutional self-government in America. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, if you have a question in the audience, feel free to raise your hand. We do have one in the chat. Tobias Gibson, if you could turn your camera on if you want to ask it. Is there a way to bring Tobias up? And while we're trying to do that, Tara, do you have one? Do you want to ask a question? Stand up and no, just go ahead and stand up and we can get the camera on you, and George should be able to hear you.
Oh, hi. Hi, George. I'm Tara Ganad. I'm a postdoc here. I wish you could have come so I could have met you in person. But I really enjoyed the talk, and I have two questions that are short and related. So the first is, you concluded by saying that this is a feature of constitutional self-governance in America. but I wonder whether relying on having to interpret the Constitution through, you call them unwritten understandings, but I'd probably say extra-textual sources, is that a unique thing about American constitutionalism, or is it a generic feature of constitutionalism elsewhere? And then the short question that leads on from that is really quite pedantic maybe, but people often say, well, the British Constitution is unwritten, the common law is unwritten, but if not, it's not, of course, it's uncodified. And so I wonder whether if you changed unwritten for extra textual, anything would change about your argument. Thank you.
No, thanks. Those are great questions. And I wish I were there. So I suppose on the first part, I don't think actually relying on unwritten understandings is only a feature of the American Constitution. I think it's a kind of it's inherent in interpreting a text. I would say generally, but I do think just on that point, it's interesting. I do think that there are constitutional governments who have tried, in some sense, to make it so. Like if you think the Indian Constitution really tries to kind of lay out. I think it's nearly 1,000 pages or so, and tries to kind of lay out and anticipate so much of what's going to be debated, in some ways to kind of close off. And I think it's an interesting question. I don't know enough. I doubt you can do it. And from what I do know of constitutional debates, I think it's difficult to. But it's interesting. It would be an interesting comparative study to think: can you close off things by kind of textual enumeration in some way, right? As if the text just kind of becomes more instruction, and you can then say, okay, so we're going to avoid some of the interpretation or building meaning that we're going to have to do. I always, just thinking of it in these terms, I always find it amusing when I sit on committees at the college, how when you have to talk about our rules or something like that, the people who don't know anything about law seem to think that if you could just write all this down correctly, nobody's going to ever debate any of it, right? And it's, I have a colleague in law and psychology, and we always chuckle thinking, boy, it's like, right, because you're just going to dissolve all interpretive questions with that. So on the second question, that's a great point about the British Constitution. It's too often called unwritten. It is sort of unwritten. There are actually, really important and powerful textual pieces that guide how we read it. I am happy to stick with unwritten rather than extra textual for maybe this. I'll give you my first reason, because I sound less like an academic if I say it relies on unwritten understanding rather than extra textual. But I more seriously, I'm not really sure that extra textual is the word I would be looking for, because somehow I want to say how you're thinking of extra textuals. There's this text, and then there's this extra textual stuff in some ways, and I guess I'm thinking that some of that stuff is more important. I don't want to just call it extra textual. That they're the ideas that frame how we think of the Constitution. And that and I guess I would say you can't actually breathe life into the Constitution or even make sense of it if you don't have some sense of that. And this is maybe too long, but let me just give you one really clear example for me in this. I think there are those who duck this question pretty clearly, and I really admire some of the people who do. One person, Judge Harvey Wilkinson, he has a great book, Cosmic Constitutional Theory, argues for judicial deference and restraint. I think it's compelling, interesting, powerful, and it totally rests on his theory of democracy. He just doesn't ever acknowledge it. And you don't read the Constitution as he does if you don't have that theory of democracy. I think it might be a powerful one. It might be the persuasive one, but it's not really extra textual, it's foundational. So.
Tobias, follow up?
Please, and thank you. So my original question was basically, which British Constitution do you mean? And by context, I'm teaching a class called American Political Theory right now at a college close to Mizzou. But I'm spending about 5 weeks getting to the Constitution. Simply put, Plato to about Paine or maybe Seabury, that kind of time frame. And so, first of all, I want to know, do you mean Montesquieu's stylized understanding of the British Constitution? Do you mean Paine, or do you mean something else? But then based on your answer to this first question, I actually wonder, to what extent are things like, Plato and Montesquieu and Locke and, I mean, these sort of, foundational understandings of just, I'll just say, democratic theory, big picture, right? To what extent do those foundational texts matter also, and the understanding, in 1787? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a big question. I feel like I might not be totally qualified to speak about, but in terms of the first part of the British Constitution, I guess I think I mean it. I mean, I suppose probably in Montesquieu's sense, but really I think in maybe a more limited sense, and that's simply that you had this common law inheritance, and that common law inheritance was as it naturally would be, kind of accorded with a certain understanding of government in the British system at the time, right? And that so much of it was hereditary, right? And I mean, right, you're years off from the Commons being anything important in that constitutional scheme. The very fact, I think, that it was, for my purposes and understanding, the very fact that it was hereditary, and actually had an established church at the time, right, just made for a radical contrast against a republican government rooted in popular sovereignty and individual rights. And so just an interesting point that comes out is, and there could be a project in thinking about this, James Iredell has these great moments during the North Carolina ratifying convention where he's like, we can't understand and accept Blackstone because Blackstone doesn't actually believe in religious liberty like Americans do. And there's this accusation, people in North Carolina aren't going to ratify the Constitution because they're like, hey, the no religious test for office in Article 6 means that you could have a Catholic as president. He actually, the one minister says the Pope could be president, and Iredell is like, that's right, or he couldn't be excluded. And he actually goes so far as to say, and I mean, think of how few Muslims there were in America at the time, or Jews. He's like, yes, it could be Mahatman, as he says, anachronistically, but or for us at least, that's not quite the right word for me. But what's interesting, I think, is, so why take selective pieces, right? Because Iredell relies on Blackstone and the common law inheritance and the British constitutional inheritance for free speech, but not for religious liberty. And so I think for my purposes, it's just that you've got to kind of draw this out in lots of ways, right? And what we're being forced to do is wrestle with, so what kind of government does this require? I mean, why does Republican government, require this kind of freedom of speech or this kind of religious liberty? And I would even say to the Jacob in the pop-up, if I'm catching it right, I think it's entirely right. Is it assumed that Republican government and the Sedition Act are at odds with one another? I mean, they're really smart people at the time, John Marshall, who thought not, partly for reasons I articulated. But my point is that really to kind of make sense of those textual provisions, right, forced us to think about what kind of government underlies the Constitution. And that's where I think the American system, we're saying what about it is distinct from the British system. And I think it's the popular sovereignty part against the hereditary part that was most important. I don't know if that's satisfying, but.
George, we've got about 10 minutes and 3 questions. So we're gonna have to be aggressive. And Jim Fleming has one. Jim, if you could turn your screen on, if we could pin Jim to ask. There we go. Jim, you're up.
Thank you very much, Justin. George, this was a terrific lecture based on a terrific book. I greatly admire the elegance of the book and the generosity of spirit that infuses it, as well as this lecture. Now, I want to pick up on your resistance to the idea of extra textual, which I commend. should you also have resisted unwritten constitution? You know where I'm going with this, because one way of putting this is that to make judgments about interpreting the text, one necessarily makes presuppositions about the text and about the character of the Constitution that it establishes. So what I want to ask you is, do you think when Scalia, or you gave the example of Kavanaugh, claim that they're just sticking with the text, do you think that's a rhetorical claim? Or do you think somehow that they believe that freedom of speech just does mean what they think it does, or the executive power just does mean what they think it is, and that they're not really making presuppositions about or manifesting one of a number of competing theories about what freedom of speech is or what the executive power is? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And just the first part, I'll be really quick. I think I tried to fudge this. I kind of liked it, but the title right to be, and I don't know how to convey this in the lecture, but I put it in the chat, is unwritten, right? I mean, which I want to say, like, yeah, I think is in lots of ways, right? It's not clear that you should actually say that this is, and that's why I would resist extra textual. They're not apart from the Constitution, right? And what we want to think of is these, especially if you accept a certain understanding of like Republican government, it infuses the Constitution. It's not this other thing floating out there. That's the proper reading of the Constitution, and that we have to read text in that way. So it's but you're right that it's hard to talk about that, saying this is the Constitution, it's just not the written Constitution. And I think that's a powerful point. I think some originalists, I actually think Scalia, for instance, or Kavanaugh, think that that's just it. It just is. Like and it's interesting, Scalia's Morrison v. Olson dissent, the executive power simply means and has always meant this. I think he just thinks that that's obvious and clear, and that's their understanding. I think other originalists, especially scholars, are more prone to acknowledge not just that the gray areas about it, but I think originalists like Randy Barnett and Keith Whittington acknowledge that much of this is actually what they would call construction, because it's not just there, right? It's not just latent or obvious in the reading, and that's where I want. And then this book, why I focused on the jurists more than the scholars, is because even though I think the scholars, when they go public, often fudge the difference, honestly. But I think the jurists tend to kind of believe that. They're just reading the Constitution, and Jim Fleming is making moral theory up.
All right, thanks, Jim. Jim, I see you're being haunted by the ghost of Lochner. Good question. So we've got two left, and we're going to pull up Connor Ewing.
Oh, let's do the student question.
Oh, student question. We got a student question. Okay, student question, and then Alan Gibson has one. Connor Ewing. We're gonna have to go quick on those. But student question. Let's go.
Live from the Kinder Institute Residential College.
Oh, awesome. You have to unmute.
That's what I mean.
There we go.
There it is.
Are we good? Yeah. Hi. So that was great. That was awesome. So my question is, if we take your idea that we should debate the ideas that animate laws and institutions over the text of those laws themselves, then does that not mean the debate should be tossed to the voters in some sort of way? And on that note, that also begs a larger question of how much power should the voters really have over the foundational ideas of a country. And the reason why I say that is because, you'll have great thinkers like, I know George Will just came out with a book, I think 2 years ago, which he argued that democracy in itself can be bad because people will take the path not set forth by them, by say the founders or other really smart people. And so the issue is, how do you allow for popular will without changing course? So I don't know if that was worded that well, but I appreciate you answering it all the same.
No, thanks. Let me try to be just brief because other questions coming up. First, I would say I applaud the part about constitutional interpretation and constitutional thinking outside the judiciary and the courts. Not only should Congress and state representatives and presidents be engaged, but we're all the better in terms of actually a project of constitutional self-government insofar as citizens are engaged in that. Now, in terms of that meaning, you kind of throw it to citizens to decide. I guess I want to be clear that, that would be, I would actually throw some of these questions out for citizens to decide, but I think that's kind of a different question to say that, when we come to some of the most disputed parts of the text, notice we don't do it with nobody's saying the president, can be elected when they're 25, 35 years of age, 2 terms, right? We don't really, those aren't contested, right? Those are settled. We don't really debate those things. And some questions kind of come up that we didn't think about. What does the Emoluments clause mean? Came up in the last couple of years. It didn't really exist for, almost 100 plus years before that. But in terms of when we are trying to make sense of what textual commands require when they're commands, or what being faithful to the Constitution requires, I think that those disputes turn on, again, these ideas that aren't clearly articulated in the text. That doesn't mean that there aren't better and worse answers. I think that there probably are, but that it's just our judgment we have there. And so there could be those who say, look, this is actually kind of open and not clear, so let's let the voters decide that issue. Right. And here's why then these kinds of things should be decided by a democratic process or by voters. I don't think that that's the only answer based upon that. Others would say, no, some of these things are actually foreclosed, say, by voters. I mean, again, right, that's going to turn on their reading of text. And my argument, though, is that this kind of argument, right, is what we should be having more of and acknowledging the assumptions, again, ideas that our reading of text, understanding of democracy rests on. I hope that kind of got at what you were asking.
Thanks, George. Connor Ewing has volunteered to reach out to you to have this argument with you another time. And so we're going to go to our last question. Alan Gibson gets that.
Alan.
Hey. So first, thanks for this. It was really good. I completely agree with your premise that there are pre-interpretive foundational questions that we have to ask. I absolutely agree with that. And thank you for reminding originalists of that. The only thing I'll say about that, and this follows from the last question as well, is what does that do on the other end about questions of the legally dispositive meaning of the Constitution and also questions of legitimacy? Because we're having huge problems with that right now, right? In terms of disputes about the court's legitimacy as well. So everybody comes clean, they follow your advice, they look at judgment, they go to foundational issues. It seems to me to make things even more irreconcilable in terms of bringing anybody together. Roberts and Ginsburg are never going to agree about the foundational structure of the Constitution. So what have we achieved more than greater understanding of the source of our divisions? How do we get back to which of these is the correct one? And I realize you began to touch on this, but I want to press you more on it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways, fine, I'm willing to highlight the disagreement. Where where we would depart is you seem to think that that there, that when we disagree, if we could all just think that there's a when they're contested, like say a Shelby County case, that there is some dispositive reading that we're like, look, this is just what the Constitution says in this case. And I guess I have my doubts there, right? When you think of, so I guess when you're thinking in legalistic terms, right, that, well, don't courts have to then kind of decide these things in accord with legal meaning. I'm not denying that at all. What I'm denying is that there's this group that is doing that, say Roberts in this case, or a Scalia, as he seems to think. And it's not that I think that Roberts may well be right some of the time and Scalia right others and Ginsburg right there. I think that could all be kind of a coherent understanding of the Constitution. But my argument is that increasingly, right, there's a group that thinks it's doing that and is arguing that the other side is not. And I'm saying, no, the other side is actually also, not always, but in many cases, trying to faithfully follow the Constitution. And that when you think that the Constitution just is this thing, say Scalia on executive power, right, in his Morrison dissent, where he says, nope, executive power everywhere and always has been this, right? And he says, it just is this thing. I'm saying that's much harder to accept than we think. And that Scalia's argument, in fact, is resting on all kinds of things that we should be aware of, because it's not clear that we should accept or share his understanding if, right, we don't think he's right about, say, what comes first. That is, in some cases, that we should be engaged in judicial restraint, right? Or in other cases, I mean, Scalia is interesting, kind of ducking constitutional text at times. So I guess that you're right, we're divided. So maybe I can't overcome division, but I want to insist on honesty in understanding the Constitution. And maybe I'm thinking that would kind of help, but I again, don't think you can overcome it by saying, oh, one side is just always completely right, because I don't think that case is as easy to make as you seem to maybe think it is, Alan.
Oh, no,
okay.
I completely agree that it's not easy to make. But, what is the other standard you're going to use for determining which of these two grand theories is correct? I guess it's what I'm suggesting. I mean, how do we go forward? Anyway, never mind.
Yeah.
That's what, let me just, I guess, end on that note, if this is the last question. But that's where I don't know what else there would be, right? There's too much of what we debate, the Constitution doesn't say, oh, this is the right and correct interpretation. And so there's nothing to do but kind of say, yeah, I mean, maybe Roberts has the more powerful reading. Maybe it's correct, right? Maybe Scalia is right that this is executive power. Although, like somebody in James Madison, Federalist 37, Federalist 41 is like, Scalia cites Madison, but Madison's rejecting the very passages that Scalia is citing for support. So, right, all I'm saying is, who else do you appeal to? I don't see, there's no higher law here to appeal to in these debates that can resolve our disputes.
George, thank you for that excellent thought-provoking talk and a good thought-provoking ending. Jonathan Gannett just joined us for the 3:30 California time lecture. He got in.
Oh, that's too bad.
Just a little bit too late, but please join me in.
Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could have been there in person. Just terrific.
Yeah, and we can
turn off the live stream.
and we'll turn off the live stream, and we will come across.
Turn off the